I was on Hill 314 when I learned what it means to kill with a voice. The ground was wet enough to stain anything it touched, and the air smelled like crushed leaves and old smoke that never fully leaves a place once artillery has lived there. I had been awake for so long that my hands felt detached, like they belonged to someone else. The radio sat heavy against my spine. The handset was slick from sweat, even though the morning was cool. I kept wiping my palm on my trousers, and it kept coming back wet. From up there, the land did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a patchwork quilt, small fields stitched together by hedgerows, dirt lanes, and stone walls. The hedgerows were thick, ancient, and cruel. They turned every field into a room with one door, and they turned every road into a funnel. In a place like that, armor can feel powerful for exactly as long as it keeps moving. The moment it stops, it becomes a question with only one answer. We knew the Germans were coming. We had been seeing the pressure building for days, like a storm you feel in your bones before the sky changes color. The talk in the night was always the same. They would try to cut the American corridor near Avranches. They would try to trap Patton's men to the south. They would try to turn the whole campaign back with one hard punch. The men in the foxholes said it like a rumor. The officers said it like a schedule. I said nothing. I carried the map. I carried the radio. I carried the kind of responsibility you cannot hand to anyone else. When dawn came, it came clean. No clouds. No mercy. I remember thinking, without meaning to, that a clear sky was a blessing for everyone except the men about to move under it. On that day, the Germans moved anyway. At first, the column was just dark shapes sliding through a narrow gap in the hedgerows, one after another, like beetles crawling out of a crack. Then the sun climbed higher, and the shapes gained edges and weight. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, fuel carriers, ammunition lorries, the kind of long, mixed column that means someone is trying to do something big and fast before the world can react. They were not stupid. They were not careless. They were desperate, and they had orders. I could feel that from a hilltop the way you can feel a man's anger from across a room. Their commander had been told to go now. Go in daylight. Go in front of the enemy's eyes. Go when every soldier on both sides already knew what daylight meant in Normandy. I brought my binoculars up, and I started to count without intending to. Not because I believed my count would change anything, but because counting kept me from thinking about the men inside those vehicles. A tank is easier to look at than a face. A moving truck is easier to accept than the idea of a driver who has not slept and cannot stop because stopping means he will be crushed by the vehicles behind him. The first fighter bombers arrived at a time that is burned into me because it was the moment my job stopped being theory. Around 8:30 in the morning, I saw the first dive and I felt my stomach tighten, not with excitement, but with a cold physical recognition. The sky had found them. The first pass did not annihilate the column. That is not how it works. The first pass did something worse. It interrupted it. Vehicles braked. Tanks tried to roll off the road into fields. Infantry scattered into hedges. The neat line became a jam. And that jam became a target that could not hide because it was now a mass. And masses attract fire, the way metal attracts lightning. This is the part most people do not understand about air power. It is not only what it destroys, it is what it forces men to stop doing. A stopped column is a dying column. A stopped attack is an attack that has already failed, even if the men in it do not know it yet. I was there to make sure they stopped. I was not a pilot. I was not an artilleryman. I was a forward air controller, a man whose weapon was a grid square. My world was a map, a compass, and a radio that could pull aircraft out of the sky like hooks. In a fight like Mortain, the hill was everything. From Hill 314, you could see far enough to watch the battle form and deform. You could see the road network. You could see the hedgerows swallow men. You could see movement betray itself. And you could do the one thing that frightened armored troops more than any gun. You could speak and have the sky answer. The system behind me was built for this moment. The British had squadrons ready and close. Planes could strike and return to rearm and come back again. It was not one dramatic swoop. It was repetition. It was pressure. It was a cycle that turned a battlefield into a schedule. And I was the man feeding the cycle. I had done the work before. Call, mark, correct, call again. But on that morning, I realized a truth that has never left me. When you are the eyes for the aircraft, every mistake is your mistake. If you put the numbers in the wrong place, the rockets land in the wrong place. If you rush a correction, you can shift destruction onto men wearing your own uniform. If you hesitate too long, the enemy moves, and your chance disappears. And then your friends die later because you did not speak fast enough. That morning, I came closer to killing my own men than at any other time in the war. The radio crackled. An infantry company below us was pinned in the hedgerows, close enough to the road that the German armor's cannons were walking fire along the field edges. The men were trapped between the hedgerow wall and the open ground, unable to move forward without being shredded, unable to pull back without being seen. They were begging for air. They were begging for anything. I remember the map on my knee. I remember the pencil point shaking. I remember the way the grid lines looked too thin for something this heavy. I gave a target location based on what I saw through binoculars and what the map said I should be seeing. It was a clean call. It was the kind of call you can make when you believe your own calm voice means you're right. Then a runner came up the slope, bent double, mud to his thighs, eyes wide in the way eyes get when a man has been forced to look at death too closely. He shoved a message into my hand. The company on the lower slope had shifted. They were not where I thought they were. The hedgerow line I was using as a reference was not the one they were behind. In that terrain, one hedge can look like another. One field corner can disguise the next. And my target, if it stayed as I had called it, was about to sit on top of Americans. For a second my mouth went dry, and my hearing narrowed until I could only hear the faint hiss of the radio and my own breath. I did not think about medals or duty. I thought about a pilot trusting my numbers. I thought about rockets turning a hedgerow into a wood chipper. I thought about a company vanishing because I had been too sure of myself. I grabbed the handset and cut in with a correction so fast that my voice did not sound like mine. I changed the mark. I shifted the strike away from the hedgerow. I did not give a speech. I did not pray. I just spoke the new numbers and waited to find out whether they had already committed to the dive. Those seconds were longer than any minute I spent under direct fire. The aircraft arrived and hit where I redirected them. The rockets walked the road and the field edge beyond it, and the strike did not land on my own men. My knees nearly failed me with relief that did not feel like relief. It felt like nausea, because the only reason I had saved them was that I had almost killed them first. After that, I stopped pretending I was simply an observer. From that point on, every call tasted like metal in my mouth. I began to understand why some veterans do not talk about what they did, not because they are ashamed of winning, but because they remember the thinness of the line between help and catastrophe. The enemy was a threat, but error was a larger one because error wore your face. The German column below us kept trying to move. Every time it tried, the sky punished it. When the armor pulled off the roads, the hedgerows trapped it. When it tried to scatter, it revealed itself in dust and broken branches and churned earth. When it stayed on the road, it became a long, visible ribbon, and ribbons are easy to cut. By late morning, the battle had a rhythm that felt unnatural. A report would come in, a movement would begin, and within minutes, aircraft would appear. There was no long suspense, no heroic duel. There was detection, then response. There was the sense that the Germans were not fighting an enemy unit. They were fighting an entire mechanism that had been waiting for them to move. From the hill, I saw something that still visits me when the world is quiet. I saw vehicles not merely destroyed, but abandoned in a way that told the story of morale collapsing. A tank sits angled into a ditch because the driver chose a ditch over the road. A half-track left running with no one inside because the crew ran the moment the engines above them grew loud. Trucks burning with a clean, bright flame that meant fuel, the kind of flame that makes men back away even if they want to save their wounded. The most frightening thing I saw was how quickly a professional formation becomes a herd. Not because the Germans were cowards. They were not. It happens to any man when he understands that movement itself draws death. You see it in their behavior. They stop looking at the ground and start looking at the sky. They start listening for engines. They start flinching at harmless sounds. They begin to treat daylight like a predator. And then I saw the moment the offensive died. It was not a single explosion. It was a long stretch of road that simply stopped changing. For an offensive, that is death. The tanks did not surge. The trucks did not push through. The column did not stretch forward. It became fixed in place, like a body pinned under a boot. And I understood that what was being destroyed was not only steel, It was time. It was momentum. It was the belief that you can cross open ground under a clear sky and still keep your plan intact. I wish I could tell you that in that moment I felt triumph. I did not. I felt something colder. I felt the weight of what it means to watch men trapped in a pattern and to know you are one of the hands tightening it. Because from Hill 314, you could see too much. You could see the confusion. You could see the panic spread along a road like a stain. You could see men trying to crawl into the earth as if France might hide them the way a mother hides a child. By the afternoon, the German attack no longer looked like an attack. It looked like a collection of separate survival problems. A tank without fuel trucks is not a spearhead. It is a steel box waiting to be found. A unit without its soft vehicles is not an army. It is a scattered set of men with rifles and no way to coordinate. The fires below us were not only burning vehicles, they were burning the connective tissue that makes armor more than metal. When the sun began to drop, the light changed and the smoke turned orange at the edges. It should have been a beautiful sight. Instead, it looked like a warning. I remember lowering my binoculars and realizing my hands were shaking again, not from fear of the enemy, but from the fear of my own precision, because that was the most frightening lesson of the day. The enemy had not been stopped by a miraculous trick. He had been stopped by a repeatable method: find, call, strike, repeat. The same cycle that saved my friends could, with one bad coordinate, erase them. The same system that made victory possible also made mistakes unforgivable. That night, when the aircraft finally thinned out and the battlefield began to quiet, men around me spoke softly, some relieved, some exhausted, some already laughing too loud because they needed to hear a human sound again. I did not join them. I sat with the map, rechecked my grid lines until my eyes hurt, and listened to the radio as if it might accuse me. I had survived plenty of days under fire, but that was the day I began to fear silence, because silence is where your mind replays the numbers you almost said. I could not see the aircraft bases. I could not see the maps on the desks behind the lines. I could not see the mechanics loading rockets onto rails. But on Hill 314, I could see the one thing that made all of it lethal. I could see the delay between a man moving and the sky arriving to punish him. People like to think air power is chaos, that it is luck, weather, bravery, and split-second decisions. From where I sat, it was closer to a machine, and I was one of the hands turning the crank. The Germans below us were not facing a single squadron. They were facing a chain. The chain started with my eyes, ran through my radio, passed through men who never saw the enemy with their own eyes, and ended in rockets and cannon fire hitting a road that a tank crew believed was still theirs. The first time I understood how fast the chain could move, it made me feel sick. I had made calls before Mortain. Some were clumsy, some were clean, but in most battles the delay is long enough that you can pretend you are only guiding, not deciding. You call, you wait, the target shifts, the opportunity fades. You tell yourself it is a normal part of war. On this day, the delay was short enough to feel like a reflex. A movement would begin in the valley, and before the men down there could even settle into the new positions, aircraft would appear again. It was as if the sky had been listening to the ground breathe. The Germans learned that lesson faster than I did. You could see it in the way they started to move. Early in the morning, they moved with purpose. Columns pressing forward, engines roaring, vehicles stacked tight because they believed speed and mass would carry them through. By midday, they moved like hunted men. They did not drive. They darted. They did not assemble. They scattered. They did not look at the road ahead. They looked at the sky behind the hedgerows, the way a rabbit watches the line of trees where the hawk came from. That change was not just fear, it was understanding. The Germans tried every method a professional army tries when it is being watched. They drove under tree lines, they pushed into field corners, they hid behind hedgerows, they covered tanks with foliage, they pulled their vehicles off the road and killed engines to erase heat and sound. All of it helped against an ordinary enemy. None of it helped against a system that did not need to guess. From our hilltop, everything a tank crew did to save itself also betrayed it. A hedgerow hides a stationary machine. It does not hide the fresh scars of tracks cutting into earth, the broken branches that hang at the wrong angles, the dust that does not settle evenly, the glint where a metal edge catches sun for half a second. A camouflage net looks perfect until the vehicle under it moves and the net shifts like a living thing. The Germans were trying to become invisible inside a landscape that punished motion, and an armored offensive cannot succeed without motion. That is the trap that killed them. On the hill, my work became brutally repetitive. Watch, confirm, call, correct, watch again. I would select a reference point, a crossroads, a church tower, a distinct bend in a lane, and I would hold it in my mind like a nail. Every time vehicles approached it, I measured distance and direction and forced myself to be slow even when everything inside me wanted to be fast. Because speed is how you kill your own men. The radio was my weapon, and it was also my enemy. It is hard to explain to someone who has never done it how a single spoken number can feel like a weight dropped off a cliff. You do not throw it and watch it fly. You throw it, and then you are blind to it. You do not know exactly where it will land. You only know where you intended it to land. Then you wait to see what the sky makes of your intention. At Mortain, I did not have the luxury of waiting long. We were embedded close enough to the fight that I could see the German armor reorganize between strikes. There were moments when the smoke would clear, and I would see crews climbing out of hatches, not running, just climbing with the careful slowness of men who know their tank has become a coffin. I would see infantry trying to drag wounded men into the shadow of a hedgerow that did not want to protect them. I would see a fuel truck catch, and the flame would jump higher than the hedges, a beacon telling the next wave exactly where to come. The first time I saw a fuel carrier go up, I thought of it as a spectacular target. Later, I learned to fear it, because that kind of burning does not end quickly. It burns long enough to draw more fire. It burns long enough to turn a road into a blocked artery. It burns long enough to make men abandon equipment that could have saved them later. By late morning, the battle had turned into a series of short, violent episodes separated by anxious quiet. In the quiet, the Germans tried to move. In the quiet, I tried to see them. In the quiet, the most dangerous thing was not the enemy. It was uncertainty. Uncertainty is what kills forward observers. There were times when I would see a shape through the breaks in the hedgerows, and I would not know if it was enemy or friendly until I watched it long enough to see how it moved, how it behaved, how it used the terrain. That is a terrible thing to admit, because it means there were moments when I held destruction in my hand while the target was still a question. The only thing that prevented tragedy was discipline. Confirm before calling. Confirm again. Never trust the first glance. Never fall in love with your own certainty. The Germans below us did not have that luxury. Their orders demanded movement. One of the most horrifying sights from Hill 314 was watching a unit attempt to restore order after being hit. You would see an officer's vehicle stop. Men would gather around it. Arms would wave. The gesture of command would spread through a group like a signal. Then another strike would come in, and the group would dissolve into the hedgerows like smoke. When the smoke cleared, the officer's vehicle might still be there, but the gestures were gone. Command does not die in one explosion. It dies in repeated interruptions until no one believes the plan can be executed. That is how air power breaks an offensive without having to destroy every tank. From above, the key was not always the tanks. It was the soft skin around them. Trucks, half-tracks, fuel and ammunition carriers, command vehicles, vehicles with radios, vehicles carrying the men who repair tracks and move wounded. In the German army, those vehicles were the blood. When they burned, the armor became disconnected limbs. The tanks did not have to be destroyed immediately. They only had to be stranded. I watched that stranding happen in real time. At one point, a German column attempted to move through a narrow stretch of road where the hedgerows crowded close. The leading vehicle was hit, and the road became blocked. The vehicles behind it stopped. The ones behind those stopped. Within minutes, the entire column had become a line of waiting targets, and the only thing they could do was back up into each other or spill into fields that could not support them. I remember thinking that this was not a tactical problem. It was geometry. The road was narrow. The hedgerows were high. The sky was open. There was nowhere to put the column that did not leave it exposed. This is where the system showed its cruel perfection. The strikes did not come randomly. They came with a rhythm that felt planned. Aircraft would attack, climb, and disappear. Then, after a short interval, another wave would come, sometimes from a different direction. The Germans began to respond not to what they saw but to what they expected, flinching before the engines arrived, freezing their movements at the wrong moments, abandoning vehicles too early, scattering into hedge lines that trapped them. Fear is contagious. Confusion is contagious. And in a hedgerow country, those things spread faster than orders. There was a point in the afternoon when I realized my own mind had begun to imitate the system. I was thinking in cycles. I was thinking in minutes. Not in heroism, not in hatred, in response times, in opportunities, in how long it takes a column to reorganize after a hit, in how long smoke hides movement, in how often I could call again before my own batteries and nerves gave out. That realization terrified me because it meant the system was not only outside of me, it had moved inside. And then came the second shock of the day, the one that made the first shock feel small. A request came from a unit lower on the slope that had been shelled and pinned. They were certain a German tank had slipped into a hedgerow pocket and was preparing to fire into their position. They needed air immediately. My first instinct was to respond immediately, to shove the coordinates into the radio as fast as my mouth could form them, to bring the sky down on the threat before it fired again. The instinct felt noble. It felt like saving lives. It was also the instinct that gets men killed. I forced myself to look again. I forced myself to confirm the angle. I forced myself to verify the reference point. And in that few seconds of discipline, I saw the truth. The tank in the hedgerow pocket was not German. It was ours, pushed forward into the wrong field corner during the chaos of earlier fighting, its crew terrified and almost as blind as the infantry calling for help. The vehicle's silhouette was wrong for a reason. The reason was that it was a friend. If I had spoken quickly, I would have erased them. I remember the heat that rose into my face, not embarrassment, but something closer to terror. I remember the way my fingers cramped around the handset. I remember thinking, with absolute clarity, that the enemy was not the only thing hunting us. The fog of war was hunting us too, and it was hunting through me. That was the moment I understood what the Germans were feeling. In a twisted mirror, they were trapped under a sky they could not fight. I was trapped inside a responsibility I could not put down. After that, my calls became slower, not because the battle slowed, but because I could no longer pretend speed was virtue. Every call was a choice between two kinds of death. Speak too slowly, and the enemy survives long enough to kill your friends. Speak too fast, and you might kill your friends yourself. The afternoon wore on, and the German offensive continued to lose shape. You could see it in what was not happening. There was no sustained push. There was no clean line of advance. There was only movement that began and then broke apart under air attack, and then began again in a different place, and broke apart again. The battlefield started to resemble a man trying to run while someone keeps grabbing his collar. Eventually, the running becomes stumbling. Eventually, the man stops trying to sprint and starts trying to crawl. From Hill 314, that crawl looked like defeat. As evening approached, the Germans became more careful, hugging cover, avoiding roads, waiting for darkness the way drowning men wait for air. It was the first time that day the battlefield gave them something. The sky would not be as lethal at night. The system would not move as fast. The cycle would pause. But the pause did not feel like relief to me. It felt like a countdown to what comes next, because I knew something the men in the valley did not want to accept. If a force is forced to wait for darkness to move, it is no longer conducting an offensive. It is hiding. And hiding is the first step toward retreat, even when no one says the word. When the light finally began to fail, I looked down at the roads again, and I understood, with a cold certainty, that what we had done was not simply stop tanks. We had stopped an idea. The idea that an armored commander could still choose daylight in Normandy and believe he would reach his objective. The idea that steel and discipline could outrun a system designed to respond. I tightened my grip on the handset as the radio hissed, and I waited for night to cover the valley, because night was the only thing that could give either side a different kind of fight. I cannot pull additional verified excerpts right now, so this chapter stays consistent with the Mortain Hill 314 framework already established and keeps the focus on character, shock, and forward momentum rather than lecture. The moment the sun started to drop, the valley changed its personality. In daylight, everything was exposed, everything was punished fast, and fear had a clean shape. At dusk, fear became patient. It hid under leaves and behind stone walls and inside engines that were suddenly quiet. The Germans below us did not look defeated at sunset. They looked like men collecting themselves for another attempt, because darkness is the one ally that cannot be shot down. On the hill, the night did not feel like rest. It felt like debt. The radio was quieter, but it never truly stopped. Reports came in like short coughs from the valley. A hedgerow line taken, then lost. A road blocked, then reopened. A tank heard, not seen. A patrol gone missing. The kind of fragments that force you to assemble a picture in your head without ever seeing the whole thing. That is how night fights are born, out of partial truths and guesses that pretend to be certainty. I kept the map spread on the ground and weighted the corners with stones so the wind would not flip it like a page. In the weak light, the grid lines looked almost black, as if the paper had been stained with soot. I traced routes with a finger and tried to imagine what a column would choose in darkness, what a commander would risk when aircraft could no longer see him as easily. That was when I heard the first sound that made my throat tighten. Engines low and careful, not the roaring confidence of morning, but the restrained, deliberate movement of armor trying not to announce itself. The sound came and went, like something breathing behind a wall. Then it returned, closer. A runner climbed the slope and nearly fell into our position. He was so exhausted he could not speak for a second, just held his knees and tried to pull air into his chest. When he finally forced words out, they were simple and terrifying. German armor was moving again. Not a rumor, not a possibility. Moving. In daylight, that would have been my moment. I would have watched. I would have called. The sky would have answered. At night, the sky did not belong to me the same way. Not because it was absent, but because it was blind in the places where hedgerows swallowed light. The system that had felt like a hammer all day became a slower tool. The Germans understood that. They were waiting for it to slow. And so was I. Because this is the sickening truth about controlling airstrikes. In daylight, you fear making a mistake because the consequences are immediate. At night, you fear something else. You fear missing the moment entirely and waking up to the results in the morning. We shifted position slightly, not far, just enough to see a different angle down the roads and the folds of the land. Hill 314 gave you a view, but it did not give you omniscience. You could still be fooled by the hedgerows. You could still miss a column if it moved under the trees and held still at the right times. In the valley, a flare went up, white and hard, hanging in the air like a suspended coin. For a few seconds, the world snapped into clarity. The hedgerows became walls again. The roads became lines again. And the movement became visible. I saw it then, not in detail, but enough. Tanks edging along a lane, spaced out, trying to avoid becoming a single ribbon that could be cut. Trucks behind them, darker shapes, careful distance, careful silence. The Germans were learning, adapting, trying to stay alive under a doctrine that demanded they keep moving. That was the first shock of the night. Not the sight itself, but the realization that they were not broken. They were hurt, but they were thinking. It is easy to hate an enemy when he acts like a machine. It is harder when you watch him adjust, when you see intelligence in his movement, and you realize he is not a target. He is a will. I reached for the handset out of habit and stopped. A strike at night is not the same thing. The margin of error expands. The risk of friendly positions becomes heavier because everyone shifts in the dark. A company can be 2 fields away from where it was an hour ago and still believe it is in the same place. A tank can reverse into the wrong lane. A patrol can be exactly where your mind insists the enemy must be. This was where the job became pure moral pressure. The infantry below us wanted certainty. They wanted a voice that could say, yes, that is enemy. Yes, the strike will land there. Yes, it will save you. But the truth was that night stole certainty from everyone, including the man holding the radio. Another flare rose, another frozen second of visibility, and in that second I saw something that made my skin crawl. A small group of men moving along a hedgerow line toward a junction. They were not running. They were not crouched like a patrol. They moved with the confidence of men who believed the darkness belonged to them. For a heartbeat, my mind did the worst thing it can do. It simplified. It said enemy. Then my eyes caught a detail that kept me from speaking the numbers. The shape of one helmet in the flare light, the way the group held spacing, the way they moved not toward our lines but parallel to them, like a screen. It was not proof. It was a hint. but hints matter when a mistake becomes bodies. I waited one more flare. The third flare went up and confirmed it. They were our men. A reconnaissance element pushing into the wrong edge of the fight, trying to do its job in darkness, unaware that from my angle they looked exactly like the enemy for those first seconds. The second shock of the night arrived inside my chest as a quiet, absolute fear. If the flares had not risen, if my eyes had not caught that one detail, if I had spoken quickly because the valley felt urgent, I would have called death onto the only men brave enough to move in that darkness. There is no medal for the strike you do not call. There is no report that celebrates the lives you did not erase. There is only the knowledge that your restraint mattered, and the knowledge that the next time you might not see the detail in time. The night went on like that, a series of almost decisions. The Germans probed, our infantry held. The valley kept whispering engine noise and then swallowing it. Every time movement appeared, it vanished again before it could be fixed into a clean target. The battle became a contest of nerves, not firepower, and the hedgerows became a third army that answered to no one. Close to midnight, a message came up the slope that finally forced my hand. A junction to the west was in danger. If the Germans broke through there, they could roll into the rear routes and turn every position on the line into a trap. The tone of the report was not panic, but something worse. It was the voice of someone trying to stay calm while holding a door closed with his shoulder. I chose a target not because it was perfect, but because it was the best I could make in darkness. I called for aircraft on the first light window they could exploit, a strike at the earliest moment before full dawn, when shadows still clung to the hedgerows, but the sky could begin to see again. The words felt thick in my mouth. I spoke them anyway. Then I waited. Waiting after a call is always the worst part. In daylight, you can watch the approach, watch the dive, watch the impact. At night and near dawn, you hear before you see. A distant engine note, then more, then the sound thickens and becomes a presence. When the first aircraft finally came in, the relief I expected did not arrive. What arrived was dread, because the strike meant the machine was starting again. And once the machine starts, it does not care about your exhaustion. It does not care that your eyes burn. It does not care that your judgment is fraying at the edges. It only cares that you keep feeding it correct numbers. The attack hit the road approach to the junction, not in a cinematic blast, but in short, violent punches. The road vanished behind smoke. Movement halted. The German push did not break through in that moment. But the third chapter is not about what happened to them. It is about what happened to me. As the smoke drifted and the first thin line of dawn began to show, I realized I had spent an entire day and night trying to be a perfect instrument. I had tried to be clean and precise and controlled, the kind of man a system can rely on. And the cost of that was that I could no longer tell where the system ended and where I began. I looked down at the valley and understood that morning was coming back, and with it, the clear sky, and with it, the fast response, and with it, the kind of killing that leaves no time for second thoughts. My hands tightened around the handset again, not because I was ready, but because I had no choice, and the first full light of day started to spill over the hedgerows.